we're going to get a little nerdy on you here with our guy, Ryan Roberts. He's from A to Z Sports. He also does podcast Rise and Draft. What's up, Ryan?
I'm good, man. I'm good. How's everything on you guys then?
Just trying to keep up, man. I feel like this is pretty fluid, especially. I guess I'd say the top 10 is pretty fluid, but like 11 through the back end, so many different things can happen. How much of what you're going to end up probably projecting, Ryan, has to do with number one, where Stafford lands, and two, the fact that the Saints said out loud, Carr's our guy?
Yeah, I mean, it has to obviously go into the conversation, right? I mean, this is the fun time of the year because after the combine, which I'm here in Indianapolis, and then after obviously free agency kind of really gets heavy in pretty soon here, that's when kind of the predictability of projecting mock drafts and all that type of stuff really comes in. Because this time of the year, people always fight with me because they're like, that guy's not going there. I'm like, guys, we don't even know if that position is going to be a team need in a couple weeks. You know what I mean? So I think that right now you're going to get a really great concept of just what these teams are going to do. You're going to hear a lot of things out here in Indianapolis. You're going to hear things that aren't true. You're going to hear some things that are very true. And you're going to really start kind of piecing together what is a team need, what is not a team need, what's a prospect fit, what isn't a prospect fit. And this is the fun time of the year because I think you get a really good concept. But I always tell people, like, down here at the combine specifically, I kind of joke about it, but it's like I only believe about like 17% of what I hear, down here. You just can't, you got to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. But hearing these general managers, these coaches, kind of understanding their philosophy. I don't really care as much about them talking player X versus player Y. I want to hear what their philosophy is because I think that tells you a whole lot more about who they're going to value, what they're going to value, and the positions that I think that are still on the front of their mind as far as what they consider to be needs and that type of thing.
Right. Let me ask you this about the quarterbacks real quick because obviously not a super strong quarterback draft, depending on how you feel about Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. But after that, it does seem to be kind of a cliff, although it sounds like some people are trying to talk themselves into Jackson Dart. But my co-host over here is one of them because he keeps seeing his name pop up with the Steelers, so he's trying to talk himself into that not being a nightmare. But
wow,
it's only Kenny Pickett's only been a couple years ago, brother. So
traumatized.
But so with a not strong quarterback class and kind of the success of some reclamation projects, whether it's a Sam Bradford or a Baker Mayfield or a couple years ago a Geno Smith, like how much do you think that has to do with sort of this looking under some rocks and existing guys in the league versus, well, hey, maybe we want to move up to 1 and take Cam Ward, or maybe we want to move up to 3 or 4 and take Shedeur Sanders? Like, how do you kind of weigh what you're hearing and what you're seeing versus how the strength of the quarterback class versus what we saw in the NFL this past couple of years?
It's a great question. I think when you kind of juxtapose the two draft eligible players with the free agents that are out there, right, like these veteran additions, I do think that the veteran market's going to be a little bit hotter than some people anticipate as far as like the money value because I don't think it's a great draft. Like it's not, right? So I think that those things are very, very, very interrelated. Like I think that it'll surprise some people because I think most people just think that like Sam Darnold on the open market's just going to get like 3 years, like 90 or 2 years, 2 years, 60 or something like that. And it's just going to kind of be a little bit of a prove it deal. I'm not as convinced about that right now. Like I'm kind of waiting and seeing a little bit because like if you do not get, because I like Cam Ward and I would be open to drafting him pretty early depending on my situation. But after that, I'm not really comfortable with a lot of guys, especially early on in this draft. So do you sacrifice that cap maneuverability to get a more known commodity versus a guy that you think maybe could be a good player? So I think those things are very, very interrelated. From like everything that I'm hearing, I think that the veteran market's going to be a little bit hotter than some people anticipate because of the draft class. And ultimately, too, you usually hear this cliche this time of year of like, hey, no, we're just going to wait till next year's quarterback class. And right now, like, it's very, very early, obviously, but the 2026 class doesn't look stellar on paper either. So I think the veteran market is going to be pretty hot because there's just no, like in 2025, you have Cam Ward, some like Shedeur, some do not like Shedeur, some like Jackson Dart, some do not like Jackson Dart. Jalen Milroe is a complete wild card and a dart throw at this point. But then 2026 again, like Nico from Tennessee and Is Arch Manning going to be that guy, even though he only has like 95 career pass attempts? Like, there's just a lot of question marks, and I think that is going to lead more to trending towards some substantial money given in the open market this year.
So how much of this do you think, because I'm looking at kind of high-end guys, and we'll see what happens with whether Carter needs foot surgery or not, but generally speaking, from a talent standpoint, the next handful of years in terms of depth, how much of it do you feel is in any correlation or not to changing schools, development? Athletes aren't getting any worse, but the quality of kind of play is, I don't know. We saw it in college basketball too for a while. It's not bad, but it's just not like, ooh, that guy. There's a lot fewer surefires, it seems, the last handful of years than what's typically been on the market.
I know in your intro you said we're going to get a little nerdy here, and I told myself I'm not going to get that nerdy, but like I think that this is one of the things that I've been talking about so much over the last couple months with the transfer portal the way it is, and players being able to move from program to program at a split second at this point. I do think it's hurting development at a few different positions. Now, I think that there are some that it won't really matter, like because I think that there's some positions that are just generally, if you are super athletic and you have good coaching, you can figure it out. But then there are other positions, like I think about offensive line, I think about quarterback, where live reps and development technically and physically are so important. So me dropping a kid, like let's say an offensive lineman who spent 1 or 2 years at program X, and then all of a sudden I throw him into a different program where he's learning some new, different technical nuance. He's part of a completely different strength and conditioning program. Like, yes, there are going to be some parallels, but there's also going to be a lot of differences. Like some people just value different things, whether it's flexibility versus, core strength. And like, there's just a bunch of different things that don't always match up consistently. And I think that there are going to be some positions. And I think we're starting to see it a little bit. Quarterback jumping from one spot to another. Offensive line, jumping from one spot to another. I do think that there's some positions that there's a lot of validity to your question of, does the ability to move around so much and go into so many different programs, does that hurt the technical and just overall natural mental development of being able to play and being able to be comfortable and being able to develop under one position coach and one coach and all those different types of things? So I do think that it is hurting, but I think it's more specifically hurting at a couple different spots like offensive line and quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point you bring up, or that DB brings up, and that you kind of reiterated there, that we always use it as kind of a reason why a quarterback struggles in their early years in the NFL. If you're like, oh man, like Baker Mayfield had 4 offensive coordinators his first 4 years, and now all of a sudden he's flourishing with a little bit of consistency. It's like, why wouldn't that be true for even younger guys? And it doesn't really seem like something people talk about very much.
Yeah. No, I really think so. I mean, because I would even say it like when it's almost like it's almost like a chain of development, in the sense of, when I always talk about players specifically going to the NFL, I always want to get them really good at one thing before I put number 2 on their plate, number 3 on their plate, right? Like I want them to master something, and then we build off of it. That's called a foundation. For quarterbacks that are jumping from one system to another, did they master anything? Did they master something and now we put some more onto their plate? Or do they have a just completely new set of rules, a new set of foundations that they have to develop from square one, right? So I think that there is a lot to it, because I mean, in a former life, I was a teacher, right? So like, I understand that, like, foundationally speaking,
that's why I like it.
Yeah, it is. So I understand that, like, for a kid to be the best version of themselves and to show consistent growth as a student, and in this case, a student athlete, you need to have a really strong foundation, and then you build upon it. But if you have a foundation and then you completely break the foundation down, or you completely change the foundation, you are hurting development without question. So I do think that there is a lot of validity to same spot, same case. You're going to develop this, and then when we develop that and you master that, then the next step comes. So I do think foundationally there's inconsistencies, and I think there's lack of development from the fact that some kids just are not patient enough in certain instances, and then in other instances, some players are forced out. Like, it's not just on the player, unfortunately, all the time in today's NIL and transfer portal system, but it is kind of hurting the long-term development of players without question.
In 2025, and I get it, I followed this. I mean, I'm only 50, but I'd say 40 years as a guy that loves the draft. It's a comp business. Hey, he reminds me of, or hey, he's this. It's just natural. But sometimes I think guys are hurt by comps, right? I look at a guy like like Tet, and regardless of however you feel about him, you'll hear these things like, hey, big body non-separators or 50-50 guys. They haven't always translated well. And it ends up kind of being like a tick or a mark against. If I'm going forward in the eval business and I'm a talent evaluator for an organization, do I want to be closer to I got comps guys, or I want to be closer to, hey, I may have to report back to my bosses and say, I don't really have a good comp, but then X, Y, and Z about said player.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all individualized, right? Like, I think I agree with you. I think the comps can just generally speaking create buckets, and we just throw players into buckets. And when we put players in the buckets, we bucket them with their strengths, their failures, and also what they weren't able to develop, right? Like me comparing someone to Laquan Treadwell, for instance, if we're talking about just like big physical wide receivers can't separate, that gives you a perception of a player. But in reality, though, every player has unique skill sets and they can do X, Y, and Z differently than player Z, right? So I think that when the evaluation process is very important because we need to separate things. This is why helmet scouting is a thing that we don't talk about. We need to talk about a lot more, and we have talked about over the last several years. Just because a player plays the same position at the same school does not mean that they have the same strengths and weaknesses. It just doesn't. Like some people would have not have drafted C.J. Stroud most likely because they're like, oh, Ohio State quarterback. But it just goes way, way beyond that. So we need to separate, and this is what I always talk about in the evaluation process. We need to separate the player, the upside, the person, and then the character beyond that, right? Like the teammate and stuff. Like this is a very multifaceted process because we always talk about, this player is getting drafted to this team, but like teams are investing in people, and I feel like we really lose sight of that. And there's some kids that are okay with just being fine and they're okay with just being good. And there's others that have this kind of unspoken feeling of I want to be the best, and that's hard to quantify in a scouting report, for watching a little bit of film or a little bit of all 22 on a player. So I think we really just need to separate that because I think the minute that we start just throwing guys in the buckets, we have failed because then we're just kind of generally speaking, and we didn't do our due diligence to really understand the full scope of a football player.
Coming from a former teacher and a special ed major, you have teacher written all over you, even in your verbiage, right? Like the whole bucket and best version of yourself and performance. So let me stay with that. What would you do with a guy, and he's getting some strange comps, but what would you do with a guy like Shamar Stewart? How individualized do you have to make the eval on a guy like Stewart?
It's a great question. It's funny. It's a quick tangent, but I was also a special education teacher, so there's a lot of parallels there. It's hilarious. For Shamar, though, it's a very fascinating conversation because traits on the edge have historically mattered, right? Like people always talk about like testing, overrated. What does it matter for? Like on the edge, it does matter. Like when you really look at the guys that have been the best pass rushers for the most part, some freaky dudes, man, some aliens. Like they really are. So Shamar has all that. He's 6'5", 280. He said he's going to run the 4.6s this week. Like he's a freaky dude. And you see the flashes on film. The problem I think that he felt at Texas A&M is, one, he was a little bit of a later riser. He didn't really kind of start coming into his own until this year. And if you watch him at Texas A&M, they utilized him all over the place. Like, I mean, he wasn't just like a wide tech. Like they were using him 4-eye, odd front at times. And that comes back to one of my earlier points is I want to make a player really good at something and major in something before I start to build off of him a little bit. So there is a little bit in me of Shamar Stewart, whatever team he wants to go to, I want them to keep it simple, super simple for him early. Like super simple. This is your alignments. These are your couple alignments. These are your couple movements up front. And now we're going to build the repertoire. I think if you're patient with Shamar Stewart, patience is the biggest thing because if you're expecting Shamar Stewart to go into the NFL next year and have double-digit sacks, I think you're going to be really, really disappointed. But if you are okay with him having 5 sacks, playing good run defense, growing throughout the year, and then having that year 2 breakout, that's what you're really investing in my opinion. So I think there's a little bit of patience there, but I also think there's a simplistic approach you have to take on. And then as he masters those things, then you add moves to the arsenal. Then you add responsibilities to his plate. If you do that well, he could end up being one of the best players in this draft, but I do not think that anyone should expect him to be one of the best players in the draft in 2025. I just don't think that is the curve that he's on right now.
This is coming from the guy that was just downing comps. So I understand I understand the hypocrisy here. But it
Yeah.
it sounds like, especially when you go from 4-eye to being in a 4 to an edge
Mhm.
guy, that it reminds me a little bit of Richard Seymour when he was coming out for school at
Ooh,
Georgia, where
I like it.
you know what I mean? It's like, gosh, but I know I'm comparing it to a Hall of Famer, right? So
Right.
it it
Well,
it seems disingenuous, but that was a lot. And he's a guy that I know a lot about Georgia's history and stuff. And that's neither here nor there. But it just
mhm.
reminds me of Seymour conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a different conversation. We don't want to compare him to a Hall of Famer, at least not yet. I mean, Daniil Hunter, obviously, that's
Yeah.
been a tremendous player for the Vikings and the Texans. He was kind of the same dude at LSU, man. Like LSU, because I think that, I mean, that was around the same era where they had like Kiki Mingo and Sam Montgomery and all those really good defensive ends. And if you watched Daniil Hunter at LSU, they asked him to do a lot of things, man. Like he was playing a lot of different alignments. And then he came out, and funny enough, I think he had like 1.5 sacks, which is the same number as Samar Stewart his final year at LSU. Now he had more tackle for loss production. Like there's some other kind of nuances to it. But when you really look at it, like I think the greatest thing for Daniil Hunter was he got in with an NFL coaching staff. He understood the foundational stuff, and then he developed over time. And within 2 or 3 years, he was one of the better pass rushers in the NFL. And Shamar can be that guy. I just, again, like if you throw him into it, because situations matter so much. If you throw him into a situation that isn't patient, then he might never come out on the other side. But if you throw him into a situation that is patient and allow him to develop and allow him to do some things very, very well and to continue to grow on it, I do think, again, that he could end up being one of the better players in this draft. It's just about development and patience at the end of the day for him.
Ryan, so I'm going to give you an option here. Would you rather talk about Travis Hunter first or running backs?
Let's go running back.
Okay.
Let's go running back, yeah.
So I think you've got some guys in this class that I think people find really interesting. Obviously, Genty gets a lot of the headlines, but depending on who you ask, including my co-host here, there's some other guys that he might likes as much or maybe even a little bit more. With the emergence of like a Saquon Barkley or a Derrick Henry and how important they were to their respective teams this year, two of the best teams in the league, do you think we'll see a little more value placed on running backs earlier in the draft, or you think we're going to kind of see more of the same? Part two of that question, kind of what pecking order do you put these guys in, including Genty?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that we're going to see a little bit more of valuing running backs in the draft early on because, unfortunately, as the game's kind of gone away from running backs being heavily valued, I feel like less players want to play running backs, right? Like that's kind of a natural thing. They're like, why would I want to play that if I'm not going to be valued in the end? So I do think that there's a little bit more, and it's not perfect for this class because there's a ton of running backs in this class, but that supply versus demand conversation. I do think that we're going to see a lot of running backs heavily valued in this class. I could see two end up going in the first round. I would only predict Genty right now, but like if Amari and Hampton from UNC went to like the Chargers in the 20s, like I wouldn't be shocked at all about it, right? So predictively, I think Hampton's in that running back 2 conversation. I think Johnson from Iowa is in that conversation as well. He's a really good football player. After that, though, like I do think it's just kind of pick your flavor. Like a lot of people like Travion Henderson from Ohio State, and if you want big plays, he's certainly right there on the cusp of that conversation. I like DJ Giddens from Kansas State though a lot, and I think I mentioned him on the show before. Like I think that he is going to be the one big value in this class. Like he's not going to go until probably 3rd round, maybe 4th round, but I do anticipate eventually he could be a 1,000-yard back in the NFL and he could be one of the more talented runners. So for me, it would probably go Genty, Amari and Hampton right now, Johnson from Iowa, DJ Giddens, and then Travion Henderson. But you could honestly flip Giddens or Henderson depending on what you're personally looking for in a running back.
It's I can't get over, this is the former running back in me talking, how incredibly deep the draft is, where I'm hoping that like a guy like Gordon can go before the 5th round and a guy like Marks gets drafted. Like I think I watch Woody Marks run, pass, protect, and catch, and I'm thinking this guy is an elite level inside runner. Like he's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. I remember watching him especially a lot when they were about to play Notre Dame because I just went through some film study. He's one of the better all-round backs in this class. Now, he's not the biggest guy. He's only about 5'9", 205 pounds, somewhere in that ballpark, but he will pass protect. He's really good hands. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but I think he set the NCAA, at least the FBS record of most career receptions by a running back because he spent some time, obviously, with Mike Leach at Mississippi State. So He catches the ball really well. He's really good in short windows. Like, he can make guys miss in space. He can make guys miss on the second level. Like, maybe nothing as far as like dynamic long speed, but like short area quickness is dynamic. So he does some really good things in tight quarters. And he's a guy that, like you said, he might go fifth, sixth, somewhere in that ballpark, just because
That's crazy.
It's such a deep class, and he's a little bit of an older guy. So if we're talking about, getting to a second contract and windows and all that type of stuff, I do think he's going to be a 24-year-old rookie, which is a little bit older for a running back, obviously, at least in the early stages of his career. But he's going to be a value. Like him, Giddens from Kansas State. There's a few guys. I feel like everyone's completely forgotten about like Kyle Monungai out of Rutgers, even though he'll probably go late and be a solid contributor in the NFL as well. Like,
or a guy like
there's
Scatabo.
So much value you find. Yeah.
So for him, is it simply about long end speed, or you kind of know you're not getting that going in? Do you want to be surprised, or you think you want to know what you're dealing with?
Yeah, Scott. I mean, it is mostly about the long speed. I think that some people question just kind of the general explosiveness, even outside of long speed as well. We know that he's a really physical runner. We know he can catch really well. We know he can block. So like, he does enough well where, like, at worst he'll be a good stable back. You know what I mean? Like, he'll at worst be like a really good 1B or at least a solid 1B type of back. So it's going to come down to your flavor in this class, man. It's always the fun part of these conversations is, like, some people are going to be Woody Marks guys. Some people are going to be Cam Scatabo guys. Some people are going to be DJ Giddens guys. Some people are going to be Kyle Monungai guys, because they're all just very different. And depending on what team's picking in a particular spot, that flavor is ultimately going to tip their hand to who they value in that particular pick.
For you, who's CB2?
CB2 for me is Will Johnson, because I do have Travis Hunter rated as CB1 at this point. So
what's
Will,
the gap there?
I think is not a ton. I would say, yeah.
So you're going with, okay. I don't know, and I'm far be it from me, because it's very opinion driven, right? It's subjective. Sure. But Will Johnson seems much more complete. I mean, boundary guy, field guy, will tackle.
Yep.
So you're banking on just sheer athleticism?
Well, I think the IQ / athleticism for Travis Hunter. I do think that there is still a nice jump that he can make if he stays at one position specifically and he focuses on it, for sure. But I do think that the zone discipline, the eyes and coverage, the ball skills combined with just the short area explosiveness and the length that Travis Hunter has is pretty special. Like, I really do. Now, Will is the higher floor corner right now, in the sense of, he reminds me of Tremaine Johnson that used to play with the Rams and the Jets, but like the good Tremaine Johnson before he left the Rams, where it was like, that kid is 6'2", really good change of direction. He doesn't have the greatest long speed in the world, and I think that's going to be the conversation about Will Johnson. Is like, I do think there's some wide receivers that are going to be able to uncover against him. I just don't think he has, generally speaking, like that great long speed.
He just it's a Michigan guy, so it's like, it's the dirty low hanging, anybody could get fruit, but he gives me some Ty Law vibes.
Oh man, I love that. Well, unfortunately, I'm a Rams fan, so one of my worst memories growing up was Ty Law absolutely beating the hell out of Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce in the Super Bowl. So, but Ty Law was awesome, man. He really
gives me some Ty Law vibes. He's savvy. He's got really good instincts. I think he covers up whatever his long speed is extremely well, because he's such a good technician.
Yeah, well, I think that the scheme is going to matter a lot for a guy like Will Johnson, because I really think if you just have a system that is going to mix in a decent amount of zone, but is also going to allow him to be physical at the line of scrimmage at times and play some press, I do think that he has Pro Bowl upside. Like, I'd be willing to take Will Johnson top 10 without question. I would even consider top 5. Like, my most recent mock draft, I think I had him going number 6 overall to the Raiders, right? So, like, very high on Will. It's an easy evaluation. As long as he's healthy, generally speaking, I just don't see him being much of a bust factor at all. Like, if he's worse than a good football player in the NFL level, I'll be pretty shocked at that point.
So, Ryan, I want to stay on Travis Hunter here real quick. So you've got to measure cornerback 1, but not a huge margin over Will Johnson. Where is he on your wide receiver rankings?
So funny enough, and I'm probably the outlier on here, I don't have him graded as a wide receiver. Okay. I don't. I think he is a corner on the NFL level. I really do. One of my greatest conversations I've ever had was with J.C. Horn when he was coming out of South Carolina. I developed a good relationship with him. And when he was coming out of high school, when he first was going to South Carolina, he was an athlete recruit. And he actually wanted to play wide receiver because obviously his dad, right? Like Jim Horn, great player. But Jim Horn, his dad, or Joe Horn, excuse me, not Jim Horn, Joe Horn. Joe was told JC, was like, look, JC, there's a lot of guys on this earth at wide receiver that look like you. But there's not a lot that look like you at corner. Like, there's just not. So I really do believe that Travis Hunter, and specifically if he wants to try to play up both sides of the ball in some capacity, it's a lot easier to be a full-time corner and play wide receiver in some leverage situations than it is to do vice versa. So I haven't graded as a corner, haven't even graded him as a wide receiver at this point, and I'm not sure I'm going to. Like, I think that he could be a good wide receiver, but I think that he's a Pro Bowl level corner if that's what he really focuses on the NFL level.
So let me ask you that. If he is a corner primarily, so we'll call it the Dion role, where he mostly plays corner, plays a little bit of wide receiver here and there when it, like you said, high leverage situations. Is that something that makes sense to you positional value wise as a potential number one pick? Because I know some people have him as the top overall pick. Does a corner, a potential Pro Bowl corner to you, make sense as a number one pick?
Not in a vacuum. No, I think he is a very unique circumstance because obviously you play two different positions potentially, and he's just kind of a rare dude in that capacity. But I've been saying all along that if Tennessee's staying at one, I think there's two ways that you go. I think it's quarterback if there's one guy you believe in, and I think it's edge with Abdul Carter. Like, I personally would not sit at one and take Travis Hunter, and it's no shot at Travis Hunter. I just think, again, if we're talking about the positional value conversation, quarterback, edge, they change the game a lot more than just like a corner does, generally speaking. So I would personally not take him number one. I'd be okay drafting him definitely somewhere in the top 10, potentially even top 5. Like, I think that is very fair in this class, but I just think generally speaking, I would value an Abdul Carter or a quarterback depending on my situation in the top 10 or first overall in this capacity.
Does foot surgery not matter for Carter for you?
I mean, I'm a little blind to exactly what the medical looks like, right? Like, I know they're talking about, like, there's X, Y, and Z things that he can do, right? Like, if he gets surgery now or he takes a different route. I am not at this moment concerned about it because he hasn't had this type of injury before, right? So if this was a recurring issue, like let's say a guy just like keeps tearing ACLs, it's like, man, that's not good, or keeps tearing up shoulders. Like, that's a recurring issue, and that's something that medically speaking is probably not a good thing. It's probably more of a red flag. So I just think generally for me, I think that when you look at a player like Abdul Carter, who hasn't had recurring issues with one particular injury, I'm going to feel okay with it until a doctor tells me that I shouldn't feel okay with it anymore.
Whether you're at Georgia or Texas, or maybe you've got a long shot, who's going to be the fastest time in the combines, do you think?
I would.
Neither guy can really catch, so I mean,
but boy, can they run!
They're fast.
They can run. Yes, they absolutely can. Arian Smith from Georgia would be my guess if I had to predict who would be the fastest guy here. One wild card, I guess, a guy. But I was told by someone who I trust pretty closly that Maxwell Hairston from Kentucky is apparently going to run a blazing time. Yes, so that apparently his goal is to be the fastest corner here, and if you are the fastest corner here, that means that you are probably running at least 4.3 high, or 4.3 low, excuse me, or maybe you're cracking the 4.2s potentially. So I would go with Arian Smith, but I do think Maxwell Hairston is a little bit of a wild card to keep an eye on.
Let me get you out of here on this. Who's the best offensive lineman in the draft? And if he is, will he have to move positions?
Great question. I think it's Josh Simmons from Ohio State, in my opinion, and I don't think that he will. The reason that I value him so heavily is that he is a true tackle. He's 34+ inch arms. He's a really good athlete. He's coming off the leg injury, which is going to cloud him. I think if he wouldn't have got hurt for Ohio State, he may have possibly gone top 10, maybe even top 5. Like, he had that quite of ascension that was happening with him. But with the injury, I think he's probably more of a mid-first round grade, or mid-first round valuation right now. So there's a chance that guys like Will Campbell and maybe even Kelvin Banks or like a couple other guys go before him. But I think that Josh Simmons, the left tackle from Ohio State, is going to end up being the best value as long as that medical checks out, because I think that he is the best true pass-protecting left tackle in this class, in a class that doesn't have a ton of those guys.
That's our guy, Ryan Roberts, A to Z Sports. Ryan, great
That's basically
stuff.
A to Z.
Pretty much. We probably could have kept you for another half hour, but maybe we'll do a wrap-up with you soon after the combine's over as well. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely, guys. Thank you so much.